Hello everyone, this is Warhawk Beyond 2040 and welcome to a very special edition of the Jazz Albums Review Series. And today I'm going to be taking a look at the solo debut albums from members of one of the greatest and most important bands in the jazz fusion genre. They were a major force on the scene from the mid-80s to the early 2000s before disbanding in 2000, and they would get back together in 2012 for a one-off reunion, which saw this band put out one more album, which would turn out to be their final one before disbanding for good in 2014. But their impact left a lasting impression on a lot of people, and they carved out their own legacy in history as one of the true heavy hitters in the jazz fusion genre. And for me, these guys need no introduction whatsoever. I am talking about, of course, the one and only legendary jazz fusion band, Tribal Tech. So, Tribal Tech was formed in 1984 by guitarist Scott Henderson, and initially it started out as kind of like a project with a revolving cast of different musicians, various different lineups. But when you think of Tribal Tech, you think of the classic lineup, which is the quartet of guitarist Scott Henderson, bassist Gary Willis, keyboardist Scott Kinsey, and drummer Kirk Covington. So, for today's special edition, I am going to be talking about each Tribal Tech member's solo debut album, and as always, I'll be talking about each one individually, and I'll be choosing which one I think is the best one. Not an easy challenge. Each Tribal Tech member brings something very different to the table. All of these albums are really good. There are a couple that are a little bit better than others, but I think what you will find with Tribal Tech, especially the individuals are concerned, that they all have their own unique personality. They all have their own distinct identities and their own styles and their own sound. Whenever you hear each one of them, you know straight away who it is. And of course, collectively together, you know it's Tribal Tech. And in my opinion, as a band, Tribal Tech have put out some of the most incredible music ever. And individually, each member has put out equally great music as solo artists. So we're going to start with the first Tribal Tech member solo debut album from guitarist Scott Henderson, and this one came out in 1994, and this one is called Dog Party. So Dog Party is the first solo album that Scott Henderson put out under his name, and although he was already long established as a musician with his band Tribal Tech, he would not put out his own solo album until 1994. Now, Dog Party is very much in the style and vein of the blues genre, and I'm not the biggest fan of blues music. I don't mind it to a point, but I feel the blues thing is a little bit too much here. There's far too many blues vocal tracks, but if you were to cut out the vocals, keep the instrumentals, you got a very good, solid, strong debut album from Scott Henderson. And the guitar playing, as you'd expect from Scott Henderson, is absolutely incredible, and he really burns it up. But I feel with Scott Henderson, his better music would come much later once he completely packed up the blues music and just stuck to the jazz fusion style of music. Because for me, that's where Scott Henderson is at his very best, and that's where he shines the brightest. So let's have a look, shall we? So all of the compositions are written and composed by Scott Henderson, and as you can see here, there's quite a lot of vocal tracks here. So the musicians we got featured on Dog Party are Scott Henderson on guitar, Kirk Covington on drums and vocals, Richard Roos on bass, Pat O'Brien on harmonica, Scott Kinsey on keyboards, Stan Martin on trumpet, Mike Witzman on saxophone, Erin McGuire on vocals, and Linda Zagarali on harmonica. And we got guest guitar appearances from TJ Helmrich, Keith Wyatt, Steve Travato, and Willie Scroggins. So, not bad. Some good solid names. But as I said, if you were to cut the vocals out of this album, instrumentally, it just absolutely rocks. So tracks we've got on here are Hole Digging, Fence Climbing Blues, the title track Dog Party, Same as You, Milkbone, Hellbent's Pup, Hound Dog, Dog Walk, Smelly Old Dog Blues, and Too Many Guitars. Now there are 7 vocal tracks on this album. If you were to cut those 7 vocal tracks out and you're left with the instrumentals, you've got a very good, solid, strong debut album indeed. Standout tracks for me are Hole Digging and Milkbone. But as I said, there's far too many vocals on this album. But if you were to cut the vocal tracks out, then you've got a much better album. But like I said, not one of Scott Henderson's best albums, but it's pretty solid for a debut. But his better stuff, I think, would come much later. So there you have it. Scott Henderson, Dog Party. Not one of his best, but if you're into the blues, then I highly recommend you check it out because there is some great playing. But I think for me, the playing really helps carry this album very well. But the vocals are just a little bit too much for me. So there you have it. Scott Henderson, Dog Party. Pretty solid debut from one of the greatest guitar players of all time. So we move on to the next Tribal Tech member solo debut album, and this one is from bassist Gary Willis, and this one came out in 1996, and this one is called No Sweat. All due respect to every Tribal Tech member, for me, Gary Willis has put out quite possibly the best music ever as a solo artist, and you get a real understanding and appreciation with this album as to how important Gary Willis was to Tribal Tech and how much of a big role he played in helping to forge the band's iconic sound. He's not only an amazing bass player, but he's a great composer as well, and he co-composed virtually most of Tribal Tech's music. And you really get to see his composing skills with his first album on full display. And he's an amazing bass player and a great composer. And if you like the fretless bass or you're into that Jaco Pastorius style of playing, you will not go wrong with this one. It's absolutely incredible. And I love it. I thoroughly love this album so much. And No Sweat is a quartet effort featuring Gary Willis on bass, the legendary Dennis Chambers on drums, Steve Chavloni on saxophone and EWI, and Scott Kinsey on keyboards, who is Gary Willis's bandmate from Tribal Tech. But a great, solid debut album, and for me, it's just amazing. Some great bass playing from everyone, and the bass is front and center, as it should be if you're buying a bass player's album. Obviously, you want to hear the guys, but at the end of the day, it's all about the bass, and this album really delivers, and then some. Musically, from top to bottom, tremendous stuff. So we've got No Sweat, the title track, great opener. Knot's Head is a wild and fun track. The Everlasting Night, which for me is probably the best track of the entire album, with great solos from Willis and Chavloni. They create this very gorgeous, haunting unison melody with the fretless bass and the EWI, which sounds like a harmonica. Absolutely gorgeous stuff. Stagger is another great track. Liquefied is another great track as well. Easy Street is great. Till the Cows Come Home, which is like the longest track of the entire album, clocking in at 11 minutes. It's an excellent track. Knot's Head 2 is a great track. Ancient Promise is a great track with the fretless bass on full display. And Him, which is like a trio track, It's just absolutely beautiful. So there you have it. Gary Willis, No Sweat. Excellent debut album from one of the greatest bass players of all time. And the standout tracks for me are No Sweat, The Everlasting Night, Till the Cows Come Home, Ancient Promise, and Him. Love this album so much. And for me, out of all of the Tribal Tech members' albums, this could very well be the strongest of all of the members' catalogues. It's just absolutely amazing. So there you have it. Gary Willis, No Sweat. Excellent stuff. Absolutely love it. So we move on to the next Tribal Tech member solo debut album. And this one is from keyboardist Scott Kinsey. And this one came out in 2006 on Abstract Logics. And this one is called Kinsymphetics. Scott Kinsey, a great keyboard player, a great composer. I find a lot of his solo stuff is kind of hit and miss. There's great tracks, but there's a lot of messing about. I know he's a huge fan of Joe Zawinul, and a lot of his music is very influenced by Joe Zawinul's Zawinul Syndicate band, and of course, very much in the style of Weather Report. Even though I do love Weather Report, and they put out some excellent music in their own right. But I did enjoy this album, which was Kinsymphetics, Scott Kinsey's first album. I did enjoy this one a lot, and there's some great tracks on here as well. There are a couple of tracks that are kind of, not so great, but the rest of it is very strong and very enjoyable. And he's assembled an all-star cast of musicians. So we got Scott Kinsey on keyboards, piano, melodica, and vocoder. Steve Chavloni on tenor and soprano saxophones, alto flute, and bass clarinet and EWI. He's pretty much on most of the entire album. And we've got guitarist guest appearances from Scott Henderson, Michael Landau, and Jinshi Ozaki. And we've got trumpet from Tim Hagens and Walt Fowler. And we've got bass guest appearances from Jimmy Earle, Gary Willis, Abraham Laboral Sr., Armand Sabaleko, Robert Hurst III, and Paul Shidahi. And on percussion, we got Brad Dutz, who was on the first couple of Tribal Tech albums, Alex Acuna, Artur Chudboykanyan, and Santnam Ramgotra. And on drums, we got Kirk Covington, Cyril Atif, the legendary Vinnie Colaiuta, and Ronald Bruner Jr. Pretty impressive cast of musicians, in my honest opinion. Can't go wrong with any of those guys. And a lot of the music is written and composed by Scott Kinsey, with one co-composition by Scott Kinsey and Steve Chavloni, and one by Scott Kinsey and Kirk Covington, which is more like an improvisation number. And got a little bit of some liner notes by Bill Makowski, and we've got a nice little quote from Joe Zawinul himself, who says, Scott Kinsey has tremendous music skills, not just playing but producing and sound programming. He is very talented. Absolutely, I'm not going to deny that. And like what Bill Makowski had to say here about this album, no chance of that on Kinsymphetics, which radiates with audacious energy and daring ideas from start to finish. And Scott Kinsey says, of course, I always want to keep the music from ever getting too boring. I could never ever accuse Scott Kinsey's music of being boring. I just feel that some of it is up and down with me, but when he cooks, he delivers big time. So we've got the title track, Kinsymphetics, which starts off like Weather Report sort of influence track. It's a great opener. This Is That is another great track. Sometimes I is another great track as well. The Combat Zone, which is a great track which features some great burning guitar playing from Jinshi Ozaki and Scott Henderson. Quartet is a really fun, fast-paced number with some excellent drumming from Vinnie Colaiuta. And Wishing Tree, which is a live improvisation by Kinsey and Tavroni, another great track as well. Big Rock is a good track. Uncle Pat's Gypsy Van is a great track. Under Radar Intro is a great improvisation, which leads into Under Radar. Shinchikuku is another great track as well, and one for Jinshi is great. But it's a pretty good solid album from start to finish. And as I said, I don't really go for the later Scott Kinsey albums that much, but I did enjoy Kinsevetics very much, and I will probably go on to say that this is Scott Kinsey's best album from his solo catalogue, in my opinion. So, standout tracks for me are the title track, Kinsevetics, Quartet, Wishing Tree, The Combat Zone, Big Rock, Under Radar, and one for Jinshi. But a good solid album, very enjoyable. If you can look past the zonal influence in the music, there's some very strong material with some great playing from not only Scott Kinsey, but from Steve Chavloni and all of the guys that are featured on this album. And if you're a fan of Joe Zonal and Weather Report, then I highly recommend you check this one out because there are a lot of similarities and there are a lot of influences from Joe Zonal and Weather Report. So there you have it, Scott Kinsey, Kinsethetics, very enjoyable and probably the one that I enjoy listening to the most out of Scott Kinsey's solo catalogue. So there you have it, Scott Kinsey, Kinsethetics, very enjoyable and pretty solid for the most part. Great stuff. So we move on to the next Tribal Tech member solo debut album, and this one is from drummer Kirk Covington, and this one came out in 2010, and it's a band effort called CPT, which stands for Covington, Philpott, and Tibbs, and the album is called Starship Cadillac. And I had no idea that Kirk Covington even put out an album because I always found it a little bit strange that out of all of the Tribal Tech members who have all put out their own solo albums, Kirk Covington never did. And much to my surprise, I found out that he actually did put out an album and is actually really good. A lot better than I expected. And I don't actually have a physical copy of this album. I only have a digital copy of this one, and I want to give a quick shout out and special thanks to George Lemie from 4 Fusion Friday and Sea of Tranquility for sending me a copy of this album digitally. Much love to you and thank you very much. And this album absolutely rocks. It's really good and it really captures the spirit of Tribal Tech very well. Think of Tribal Tech as a trio because it's kind of like that. It's really good. And CPT is comprised of Kirk Covington on drums, Rufus Philpott on bass, and Scott Tibbs on keyboards. So it's very much a keyboard trio album. But wow, this album is really good. And all of the compositions are written and composed by all three members. And apart from one vocal track, this is a very strong album from start to finish. And I really enjoyed this one a lot. So I've listened to this one a few times already, and it just really blows me away. The playing from everyone. Kirk Covington sounds as good as he's ever done behind the drum kit. Rufus Philpott really channels in the spirit of Tribal Tech bass player Gary Willis. He's just showcased and burns it up on bass throughout the entire album. And Scott Tibbs at times does sound like Scott Kinsey, but he's very much his own man, and he's just an unbelievable keyboard player. But really love this album a lot, and I would put this one up there with Gary Willis's No Sweat in terms of enjoyable music. It's just so good. So the first track we got is Sleek, which is a great opener. Pickled Pig's Feet is a great track as well. Don't let the name fool you. It's a funny name, but it's a great track. Paramedic is a great track as well. Temperance is another great track as well. Drop the Chalupa is a great track as well. The the title track, Starship Cadillac, is a great track as well. Chase the Blues is kind of a hit and miss for me. I could have done without the vocal track, but take that away. It's a really good, strong album anyway. But thankfully, there's only one vocal track, so I forgive it. We got Disgruntled Consummate Monkey intro, which is a great track, which leads into Disgruntled Consummate Monkey. Great track also. Just in Case is another great track as well. Enough for Free is another great track as well. Still Silence is good, and Neverworld is a great closer as well. But the entire album, minus the vocal track, excellent stuff. Love it. And Rufus Philpott, what a bass player. He's so good. Scott Tibbs, great keyboard player. Lots of great piano work as well. Great keyboard solos as well. And Kirk Covington, he's just a machine on the drums. And there's a lot more looseness to his playing. He's not just pounding the hell out of the drums. He really gets to show more of his improvisational side on this album. And he sounds amazing. You know, he can play laid back as well. A lot of people know him as the big powerhouse drummer from Tribal Tech. He really lets loose here in the trio setting. He just sounds incredible. So, standout tracks for me are Sleek, Temperaments, Starship Cadillac, Disgruntled Consummate Monkey, Enough for Free, and Neverworld. But the entire album is absolutely brilliant from start to finish and a lot better than I expected. And this one really turned out to be the surprise out of all of the Tribal Tech members' albums. Really like this one a lot, and hopefully there'll be a follow up at some point. But hard to believe that, you know, I didn't even know about this one, but I'm really glad that I found out about this one, and I'm really glad I got to hear it because it's absolutely brilliant. So there you have it. CPT Starship Cadillac, highly enjoyable and one of the best albums I've ever heard in quite some time. Just wish I'd found out about it years earlier, but really good stuff here. So there you have it. CPT Starship Cadillac. Excellent stuff. So which Tribal Tech member do I think had the best solo debut album? Well, they're all good. Obviously, there are a couple that I feel are a little bit better than others. But one thing that I learned about all of the Tribal Tech members' solo albums, they're all different. They all have their own personality and they all have their own styles. Scott Henderson's debut album is very much in the blues style of music. Gary Willis's album is very much in the jazz fusion realm of music. Scott Kinsey's album is very heavily influenced by Joe Zawinul, and Kirk Covington's album is very much a straight up fusion album. But they're all good. They all have some things that I like about them. And as I said earlier, there are a couple that are, I feel, a little bit better than others. But if I had to go with one Tribal Tech member who I think had the best first album, it's definitely got to be Gary Willis, No Sweat. For me, this is my favourite album from all of the Tribal Tech members' solo albums, and I think this one really stands up very strong. CPT is definitely up there, but I think this one is just a little bit more stronger. And I feel out of all of the Tribal Tech members, Gary Willis has put out the best music, in my opinion, from his solo catalogue. But this one for me could very well be his best one. And for me, it's the best solo debut album from all of the Tribal Tech members. I just think it's really good. And as I said earlier, if you like fretless bass and you like the style of Jaco Pastorius, this is definitely the one to check out. It's really good. And as I said at the beginning, Gary Willis to me is the MVP of Tribal Tech. Sure, they would have sounded great with a different bass player, but I think with someone like Gary Willis, he just gave them that little bit extra, in my opinion. So there you have it. Gary Willis, No Sweat, for me, the best Tribal Tech member solo debut album, and in my opinion, the one member who probably has the best solo catalogue of music, barring Scott Henderson. Excellent stuff. Love it. So that's going to be it from me. I'm going to wrap this up now. What's your favourite Tribal Tech member solo debut album? Is it Scott Henderson, Dog Party, Gary Willis, No Sweat, Scott Kinsey, Kinsymphetics, or Kirk Covington's CPT, Starship Cadillac? There's no right or wrong answer. We all have our favourites. You know what to do, guys. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, leave your thoughts and comments down below. And I will see all of you next time for another edition of the Jazz Albums Review Series. So until then, take care, everybody, and stay safe. And once again, as always, much appreciated. Thanks for listening.